I was at 26,000 feet over the Rhine Valley when I watched a dead aircraft refuse to die, when I saw a P-51 Mustang with a seized engine and a frozen propeller outrun 4 Messerschmitt 109s like they were standing still, like they were painted on the sky while he was the only thing actually moving. And I know that sounds impossible, because it was impossible. Because every law of physics I'd learned, and every principle of aerodynamics I'd relied on to stay alive for 2 years of combat, told me that what I was seeing couldn't happen. But I watched it happen anyway, watched it unfold with such crystal clarity that 40 years later I can still see the sunlight catching on that motionless propeller blade, can still see the smoke trailing from the engine cowling, can still see the way Captain James Holloway's aircraft climbed without thrust and accelerated without power and moved through the sky like something that had decided the rules no longer applied to it. My name is William Carson. I flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group out of England. And I'm telling you this because I'm 81 years old, and if I die without speaking this truth, then it dies with me. And some things are too strange to let them vanish just because they're strange. If you're watching this, comment where you're from and subscribe, because this story needs witnesses, needs people who'll remember after I'm gone that sometimes the sky shows you things that manuals can't explain and reports won't acknowledge. The P-51 Mustang was the finest fighter aircraft of the war, and I'm not saying that from nostalgia or patriotism, but from the practical understanding that comes from betting your life on a machine every time you take it into combat. It had a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that produced 1,400 horsepower when you treated it right, had range that let us escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, which meant the bombers actually had protection when they needed it most. And it had speed and maneuverability that made it superior to anything the Luftwaffe could field by 1945, when experienced German pilots were dead and replacements were kids with barely enough training to take off and land. I'd grown up in Montana, where the sky was so big you could see tomorrow's weather arriving from 100 miles away, and I'd learned to fly in civilian aircraft before the war, had that foundation of stick and rudder feel that you can't teach someone who doesn't have natural sense for how air moves around wings and how aircraft respond to control inputs. When the Army sent me to advanced training and eventually to Mustangs, I felt like I'd found the machine I was meant to fly. Felt like the aircraft and I understood each other in ways that went beyond mechanical interface, and after 6 months of combat, I could tell you what was wrong with the engine by listening to how it sounded, could feel through the stick when something was about to fail, could sense when the aircraft was healthy and when it was on the edge of breaking. Our squadron was based at Leiston in East Anglia, and we flew escort missions almost daily when weather permitted, protecting the heavy bombers that were systematically destroying Germany's industrial capacity and killing thousands of civilians in the process, though we didn't talk about that part. Didn't discuss what was actually happening on the ground beneath the smoke and fire we could see from altitude. My wingman was Robert Mitchell, a kid from Ohio who'd washed out of bomber training because he got airsick in formation, but who'd discovered that flying fighters suited him better, because you could maneuver aggressively without worrying about the comfort of crew members or the structural limits of a heavy aircraft loaded with bombs. Mitchell was good, had natural deflection shooting ability that let him lead targets intuitively without conscious calculation, and he'd saved my life twice by calling out bandits I'd missed in my scan, and I'd saved his once by breaking into an attack that would have killed him if I'd hesitated, and that kind of mutual debt creates bonds that outlast the war and the decades after. The man who led our flight that morning was Captain James Holloway, and if you'd asked anyone in the squadron who the best pilot was, they'd have said Holloway without hesitation, without even needing to think about it. He had 23 confirmed kills, and had been flying since 1943, which meant he'd survived long enough to accumulate not just skill, but wisdom, That particular kind of combat wisdom that comes from making mistakes and living through them and learning what the margins were between calculated risk and suicide. Holloway flew with precision that made every maneuver look choreographed, like he'd practiced each engagement 1,000 times and was just executing movements his muscles remembered. And he had this way of staying calm over the radio, even when situations were desperate, this tone that made you believe everything would work out because Holloway was there and Holloway knew what to do. We trusted him the way you trust gravity, assumed he'd always be there, always pull off whatever needed pulling off. And that assumption made what happened that morning even more disturbing, because it suggested that even Holloway was operating on borrowed certainty, that even the best of us were one mechanical failure away from discovering how little control we actually had. I joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, fresh from college where I'd studied engineering and learned the mathematics of flight without understanding what flight actually felt like, what it meant to move through three-dimensional space at speeds that gave you seconds to make decisions that determined whether you lived or died. The training had been brutal in the way that accelerated wartime training was brutal, compressed years of normal instruction into months of intensive focus, and they'd washed out half our class for various reasons. Some couldn't handle the stress, some couldn't master the physical coordination required. Some just didn't have the particular combination of aggression and caution that fighter pilots needed to survive. I'd made it through primary training in Stearmans, through basic in BT-13s, through advanced in AT-6s, and finally to operational training in P-40s before transitioning to Mustangs. And each aircraft had taught me something different about how metal and air and human intention combined to create controlled flight or uncontrolled death. The transition to combat had been jarring even though training had tried to prepare us for it, because training couldn't replicate the psychological reality of having people try to kill you, couldn't simulate the way time stretched and compressed during engagement, couldn't teach you how to function when every instinct was screaming at you to freeze or flee. My first mission over Europe, I'd been so terrified that I'd forgotten to turn on my gun sight, had flown the entire mission with weapons that couldn't have hit anything even if I'd fired them, and it was only after we landed that I'd realized my mistake and understood how close I'd come to being useless to my flight if we'd been engaged. The second mission I'd overcorrected had been so determined not to freeze that I'd been too aggressive, had wasted ammunition on shots that had no chance of hitting, and had broken formation pursuing a target that led me away from mutual support. And Mitchell had called me back before I got myself killed, had said over the radio with remarkable patience, given that I was endangering both of us, that maybe I should save the heroics for after I'd learned to fly properly in combat. By my 10th mission, I'd started to understand the rhythm of it, started to develop the particular situational awareness that let you track multiple threats while maintaining formation, while monitoring your instruments, while managing your fuel and ammunition. Started to understand that combat flying was less about individual dogfighting skills and more about teamwork and energy management and making the right decisions in the seconds before situations became irreversible. By my 20th mission, I'd gotten my first kill, a Focke-Wulf 190 that I'd caught during a diving attack on the bomber stream, and I'd felt simultaneously exhilarated and sick, proud of my shooting and horrified by what it meant that someone had just died because I'd pulled a trigger. And Holloway had told me afterward that both feelings were appropriate, and that pilots who felt only one or the other were dangerous in different ways. The mission briefing that morning in March of 1945 had been routine in the way briefings were routine by that point in the war, which meant we all knew Germany was dying, but dying violently, was using its last fuel and its last pilots to inflict maximum casualties before the inevitable end. We were escorting B-17s to synthetic oil refineries in the Ruhr Valley. targets that intelligence claimed were critical to Germany's ability to continue fighting. Though by March it was clear that nothing was going to let Germany continue fighting much longer, that we were just accelerating the conclusion of something that was already decided. The briefing officer had shown us reconnaissance photos of the target area, had explained the expected flak concentrations and fighter opposition, had given us routes and altitudes and radio frequencies, had told us what to do if we were hit and had to bail out, and through all of it I'd sat there drinking coffee that tasted like burned dirt and trying not to think about the fact that this was my 47th mission and that nobody in our squadron had completed more than 60 without being killed or wounded or suffering some kind of breakdown that made them unfit for combat. We took off in darkness, 24 Mustangs climbing through cloud layer into stars, and we formed up over the channel using radio navigation and the lights that lead aircraft carried, and we climbed to altitude where the air was thin enough that you had to consciously remember to breathe, where your oxygen mask became the only thing preventing unconsciousness, where the cold seeped through your flight suit and made your hands stiff inside your gloves, even though the cockpit heater was running at maximum. The sun caught us at 18,000 feet, turned the world below into layers of gold and shadow, turned the cloud banks into landscapes of light and darkness that looked solid enough to walk on. And ahead of us, the bomber stream was assembling, hundreds of B-17s gathering into the combat boxes that gave them mutual defensive fire support. And watching them form up always made me think about the men inside those aircraft, the crews who were about to spend hours in unheated aluminum tubes being shot at by everything Germany had left. And I felt grateful that I was flying a single-seat fighter where the only life I was responsible for was my own. We took our positions above the bombers, 4-ship flights arranged in combat spread that gave us visual coverage of the entire formation and allowed us to support each other if we were bounced by enemy fighters. Holloway was Red 1 leading our flight. His wingman was Red 2. I was Red 3 with Mitchell as Red 4, and we'd flown together enough times that we moved as unit without needing constant radio communication. Knew, by the way, someone positioned their aircraft, what they were thinking, and what they needed from the rest of the flight. The bomber stream left contrails that stretched back to England, white scars across blue canvas, and beneath us was the patchwork of German countryside, fields and forests and cities that from altitude looked like models, looked harmless, looked nothing like the places where people were living and dying and trying to survive the war that we were bringing to them. We'd been on station for about 90 minutes, had crossed into German airspace and were approaching the initial point where the bombers would start their bombing run, when Holloway's voice came over the radio with the controlled urgency that meant something was wrong, but not yet critical, said, "Red 1, I'm showing oil pressure drop and coolant temp rising, going to have to throttle back." The Merlin engine was reliable but complex, had dozens of systems that could fail, and oil pressure and coolant temperature were the primary indicators that something catastrophic was developing. Meant that the engine was either losing lubrication or overheating or both, and if you didn't address it immediately, you'd seize the engine and transform your aircraft from fighter to glider. The protocol was for him to leave formation and head for home with his wingman escorting, and the rest of us would continue the mission. But before he could execute that procedure, his engine situation deteriorated catastrophically, went from warning to emergency in the span of maybe 10 seconds. I could see smoke starting to trail from his cowling, could see the white smoke that meant coolant was burning, could see his propeller rotation slowing as power dropped. And then I heard him say over the radio, his voice flat with the particular calm that comes from focusing entirely on survival, "Red 1, engine failure, propellers seizing, attempting restart." A seized propeller is one of the worst things that can happen to a single-engine fighter, because it doesn't just mean you've lost thrust. It means you're flying with massive drag, with a frozen blade creating resistance that's almost like having an air brake deployed. And I watched Holloway's airspeed bleed off rapidly as the dead engine and stationary propeller transformed his Mustang from sleek fighter into falling brick with wings attached. He nosed down to maintain flying speed, began the glide that every pilot practices but prays never to need, the long, shallow descent that trades altitude for distance and hopes that distance is enough to reach friendly territory, or at least reach territory where you might survive bailout. His wingman moved into escort position, tucked in close to provide protection if enemy fighters showed up, and I could see Holloway working in his cockpit, could see him going through the restart checklist, trying to get the engine to catch, trying to get the propeller to rotate again, but nothing was working. The propeller stayed frozen in position, and the smoke kept trailing, and the altitude kept bleeding away. I was calculating in my head whether he'd make it to Allied lines, doing the math of glide ratio and wind and distance, and the numbers weren't good. The geometry was wrong. He'd be on the ground or bailed out long before he reached safety, and I was already thinking about how we'd coordinate the search and rescue, how we'd call in his position, and hope that somebody could get to him before the Germans did. That's when the Messerschmitts showed up, 4 Bf-109s diving from the sun, and they'd clearly spotted Holloway's damaged aircraft trailing smoke and identified it as easy kill. Were moving to finish him before we could intervene. I called out the bandits over the radio, said, "Red 3, 4 bandits 10 o'clock high, engaging," and I pushed throttle forward and rolled into diving turn that would give me the speed to intercept. And Mitchell was right with me, our 2 aircraft accelerating toward the engagement, and Holloway's wingman was already turning to meet the lead 109, but we were all too far away. The geometry was wrong. The Germans would reach Holloway before we could reach the Germans, and I was watching what I thought was going to be the death of the best pilot in our squadron, was watching it happen in that stretched-out time sense that combat creates, where everything is simultaneously too fast and too slow, where you can see disaster developing but can't move fast enough to prevent it. Then Holloway did something that made no sense, that violated every principle of energy management I'd ever learned. Instead of maintaining his glide angle, instead of trying to preserve what little altitude and airspeed he had left, he pushed the nose over harder, accelerated his descent like he was trying to build up speed for something. And I started yelling at him over the radio, said, "Red 1, maintain your glide, you're losing altitude too fast." But he wasn't responding, was apparently so focused on whatever he was planning that radio communication was beyond him. I could see his airspeed increasing through his canopy. We were close enough that I could see his instruments if I looked carefully, and watched the needle climb past speeds that should have been dangerous for an aircraft with battle damage, past the red line that marked structural limits where the aircraft might come apart from the forces acting on it, and his Mustang was shaking visibly, was vibrating from the airflow over damaged surfaces and the stress of moving through air at speeds it wasn't designed for. But it was holding together, and I didn't understand what he was doing. Didn't understand how building speed in a dive was going to help him when he had no power to convert that speed into anything useful, no way to trade velocity for altitude when he needed it. The lead 109 opened fire, and I could see the tracers arcing toward Holloway's aircraft. Could see the bright lines of cannon rounds tracking the path where he should have been based on his previous flight path. But he rolled his dead-engine Mustang in a maneuver that should have been impossible, because rolls require energy, require either thrust or altitude to trade for the angular momentum needed to rotate around the longitudinal axis. And the German pilot was so shocked by seeing a damaged aircraft execute aggressive defensive maneuver that he missed completely, overshot Holloway's position without correcting his aim, and I heard German radio chatter, Heard voices speaking rapidly in a language I didn't understand, but with tone I recognized as confusion and disbelief. And that's when reality stopped making sense, when the situation transformed from desperate combat into something that resembled hallucination or dream or religious vision, because Holloway's aircraft, which should have been in unrecoverable dive, which should have been seconds from impact with the ground, suddenly arrested its descent and began climbing, actually gained altitude without any visible means of producing thrust. And the propeller was still frozen, was still not rotating, was still just dead weight creating drag. But the aircraft was accelerating upward, like it had been caught by invisible hand and thrown skyward, like gravity had reversed, or like some force I had no name for, had decided that this aircraft specifically was exempt from the rules that governed everything else in the sky. I checked my instruments immediately, my first thought being that I was experiencing hypoxia, that my oxygen system had failed and I was hallucinating from oxygen deprivation, but my oxygen flow indicator showed normal. My altitude was stable, everything read exactly as it should. And Mitchell's voice came over the radio saying, "Red 4 to Red 3, are you seeing this?" Which meant it wasn't just my perception, wasn't just me having a stroke or breakdown or equipment failure. This was happening in shared reality that both of us were witnessing. And when I looked at the rest of our formation, I could see other aircraft turning to watch, could see pilots craning their necks to track Holloway's impossible climb. Holloway's Mustang climbed through the scattered German formation, climbed with acceleration that increased rather than decreased, climbed like something was pulling it upward rather than pushing it, and where it passed the 109s, they broke formation and scattered, didn't try to engage, didn't try to pursue, just fled in different directions like they'd encountered something they couldn't fight, like they'd seen something that made them question whether they understood the fundamentals of reality they were operating in. The physics couldn't work, shouldn't work according to any principle I'd learned in engineering school or flight training, because thrust comes from propellers or jets pushing air backward, and Newton's third law creates equal opposite reaction that pushes aircraft forward. But Holloway's propeller wasn't rotating, wasn't pushing anything, was just sitting there frozen and creating drag. Massive drag that should have been slowing him down, not speeding him up. And yet his aircraft was accelerating, was gaining speed while climbing, which meant it was gaining both kinetic energy and potential energy simultaneously, without any apparent energy source to explain where that energy was coming from. My brain kept trying to construct explanations, kept reaching for possibilities that would let me maintain my understanding of how the world worked. Maybe he had auxiliary power unit that I didn't know about. Maybe there was secret modification to certain aircraft that provided emergency thrust. Maybe he'd figured out some way to restart the engine that I couldn't see from my position. But none of those explanations fit what I was actually observing, because the acceleration was too high, was beyond what any emergency system could provide, was like watching rocket launch or watching something fall upward instead of down. The sound that came over the radio from the other pilots in our squadron was this collective intake of breath, this shared gasp of men watching something impossible, and I realized that everyone who had line of sight to Holloway was seeing the same thing, was witnessing the same violation of physics, and that meant this wasn't instrument malfunction or perceptual error, but actual event happening in physical space where multiple independent observers were all recording the same impossible data. The German formation disintegrated completely. 4 aircraft that had been coordinated attack element becoming 4 individual pilots fleeing in different directions. And their radio chatter had changed from tactical communication to what sounded like panic. Voices overlapping and rising in pitch and using tone that transcended language barrier because fear sounds the same in any language. Holloway's Mustang continued climbing, reached 30,000 feet, which was 2,000 feet higher than where his engine had failed, and it hung there suspended for a moment like it was deciding what to do next. like whatever force was acting on it had reached some kind of limit or threshold, and in that moment of suspension I could see the frozen propeller blade catching sunlight, could see the smoke still trailing from the cowling, could see every detail of the aircraft with perfect clarity because my brain was recording everything with the desperate precision that comes from knowing you're witnessing something you'll never be able to explain. Then the propeller started rotating again, just suddenly began spinning like the engine had restarted, like whatever had seized it had unseized, or like the engine had somehow fixed itself. And I could see the smoke from the cowling change color, change from white coolant smoke to the grey-black smoke of an engine running rough but running. And Holloway's voice came back on the radio, sounding completely normal, sounding like nothing unusual had happened. And he said, "Red 1, engine restart successful, returning to formation," and his tone was so casual, so devoid of acknowledgement that something impossible had just occurred, that for a moment I wondered if maybe I was crazy, maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, maybe the stress of combat had finally broken something in my brain and I was hallucinating. But Mitchell was already asking over the radio, his voice carrying the same confusion I was feeling. "Red 1, what the hell was that maneuver?" And Holloway's response was just, "Not sure. Red 4, some kind of aerodynamic effect I wasn't aware of. Suggest we discuss after landing." And his voice carried weight that made it clear this wasn't conversation to have over open radio where anyone could be listening, where channels might be monitored or recorded or intercepted by enemy intelligence. The rest of the flight rejoined formation without further comment, and we continued the escort mission like nothing had happened, like we hadn't just watched physics surrender to something we had no framework for understanding. And the bomber stream ahead of us proceeded to their target and dropped their ordnance and turned for home while we provided top cover and watched for additional enemy fighters that never materialized. If you're still here, stay until the end. The truth hidden in these final moments will change everything you believe about what happened in the skies over Europe. We completed the escort mission, stayed with the bombers through their run over the target and their turn for home, and the entire time I couldn't stop watching Holloway's aircraft, couldn't stop checking to see if his propeller was still rotating, if his engine was still producing power, if reality had returned to normal, or if we'd crossed into some alternate version of physics where different rules applied. The bombers dropped their ordnance, and we saw the explosions bloom below us like flowers made of fire, saw the industrial complex transform into smoke and flame, and normally those sights would have occupied my mind for the entire return flight, would have made me think about what we were actually doing up here, what we were participating in. But instead I kept replaying what I'd seen, kept trying to fit it into framework that made sense, and every framework I constructed collapsed under the weight of what I'd actually witnessed. The flight back to England took 2 hours. 2 hours of monitoring fuel and watching for stragglers from the bomber formation who might need escort, and nobody said anything over the radio about what had happened. Maintained professional silence like we'd been trained to do, but I could see other aircraft in our formation, positioning themselves where they could watch Holloway, could see that I wasn't the only one who wanted to keep visual contact with something that had just demonstrated it didn't follow the rules we'd all bet our lives on understanding. We crossed the channel and descended through cloud layer and entered the traffic pattern at Leiston, and I went through the landing checklist mechanically, lowered gear and flaps, and brought the Mustang down onto the runway, and rolled out and taxied to my hard stand, and the entire time my hands were shaking, were trembling with adrenaline and confusion and the particular psychological strain that comes from watching reality betray itself. I shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for a moment after the propeller stopped rotating, sat there in the sudden silence, and tried to organize my thoughts into something coherent enough to report in the debrief. Tried to find language that would describe what I'd seen without making me sound insane. The crew chief came to help me out of the cockpit and asked if everything was okay with the aircraft, and I told him everything was fine with my aircraft, but that Captain Holloway's Mustang needed careful inspection, needed to have the engine torn down and examined because something had happened up there that I couldn't explain, and the crew chief looked at me with the particular expression mechanics give pilots when they think the pilot is making excuses for rough handling, but he nodded and said he'd put it on the maintenance schedule. The debriefing was scheduled for an hour after landing to give everyone time to complete post-flight procedures and use the latrine and gather their thoughts. And when we assembled in the briefing room, I could feel the tension before anyone spoke, could feel that everyone who'd been on that mission knew something impossible had happened, but nobody wanted to be first to say it, because being first meant being the person who'd get labeled unstable or unreliable. The squadron commander was there along with the intelligence officer who took notes on everything. And the room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke and the particular sweat that comes from flying at altitude in heavy flight suits. And I took a seat next to Mitchell and waited for someone to start talking about what we'd all seen. The squadron commander asked for reports starting with Holloway, and Holloway stood up and delivered his account in the same calm tone he'd used over the radio, said he'd experienced engine failure due to oil system malfunction, had attempted to glide toward friendly territory, had been engaged by enemy fighters, had taken evasive action while trying to restart the engine, and during the evasion his engine had successfully restarted, allowing him to return to formation, and his description was so mundane, so stripped of the impossible elements, so clinical and procedural that it felt like gaslighting, like he was deliberately denying shared experience we'd all witnessed, like he was rewriting history in real time and expecting us all to accept his version despite what our eyes had told us. But then Mitchell stood up, and Mitchell had never been good at keeping his mouth shut when something needed saying, and he said, "With respect, sir, that's not what happened." And the room went quiet, went silent in the way rooms go silent when someone has just challenged authority or violated protocol. And Mitchell continued, said, "What we saw was Captain Holloway's aircraft climb without engine power, saw it accelerate while the propeller was seized, saw it move in ways that violated every principle of flight dynamics I've ever learned." And his voice was steady, but I could hear the strain in it, could hear that he was as shaken as I was and was trying to make sense of the senseless by forcing it into open discussion. The squadron commander's expression changed, shifted from interested to concerned, and I could see him evaluating Mitchell, could see him trying to determine whether Mitchell was having some kind of breakdown, or whether there was substance to what he was saying. And before the commander could respond, I stood up and confirmed everything Mitchell had said, used my engineering background to describe what I'd observed in technical terms, talked about thrust-to-weight ratios and energy states and the impossibility of sustained climb without power source, tried to make clear that I wasn't describing subjective impression, but objective observation of aircraft performance that violated every specification I knew. The intelligence officer was taking notes, but his expression suggested he was documenting something for medical review rather than operational intelligence. And when several other pilots stood and confirmed similar observations, the squadron commander held up his hand for silence and said that clearly something unusual had occurred, but that the important thing was everyone had returned safely, and that Captain Holloway's quick thinking had saved both his aircraft and his life, and his tone made clear that he was closing the discussion, that further speculation about impossible maneuvers was neither welcome nor productive. He looked directly at Holloway and asked if there was anything to add to his original account, and Holloway stood again and said, "I can only report what I experienced from inside the cockpit and what my instruments showed. I can't speak to what it looked like from outside, but I acknowledge that the engine restart was unusual, and I'd recommend the maintenance team inspect the aircraft thoroughly to determine what caused the failure and what allowed the restart." The debriefing ended there. ended with that unsatisfying non-conclusion where authority had decided that mystery was preferable to investigation, where acknowledging the impossible was seen as more dangerous than pretending it hadn't happened, and we were dismissed back to our barracks where we were supposed to rest before the next day's mission. I tried to catch Holloway outside the briefing room, wanted to talk to him privately about what had actually happened, but he saw me coming and shook his head slightly, a gesture that said not here, not now, maybe not ever, and he walked away, leaving me standing there with questions that felt like physical weight. Later that evening, after dinner in the officers' mess, where everyone was carefully not talking about the incident, I found Holloway sitting alone outside his barracks, smoking a cigarette and staring at the sky like he was looking for answers in the clouds. I sat down next to him without asking permission and waited for him to acknowledge my presence. And after maybe 5 minutes of silence, he said without looking at me, "Carson, I don't know what happened up there. I know what it felt like from inside the cockpit, and I know what my instruments were telling me, and neither of them match what you apparently saw from outside. And I've decided that trying to understand it is less important than accepting that I'm still alive, and my aircraft is still functional, and the war is almost over." I asked him what his instruments had shown, what he'd experienced from inside, and he took a long drag on his cigarette and said, "The engine seized just like I reported, lost oil pressure, and the propeller stopped rotating, and I was preparing to bail out because the glide angle wasn't going to get me home. And then the Germans showed up, and I figured I was dead. And I did what any pilot would do, which was try to build up speed for one final maneuver, try to make myself hard to hit even if it meant crashing sooner. And when I rolled to evade that first burst of fire, something happened, something I don't have language for. The aircraft just responded differently than it should have, moved differently, felt like it was being pushed or pulled by something external. And my airspeed indicator was showing numbers that made no sense. And my altimeter was showing climb when I should have been descending, and I just held the stick where it needed to be, and tried not to think too hard about why it was working, because thinking about it might have broken whatever spell was keeping me alive." He finished his cigarette and immediately lit another one, and his hands were shaking slightly, and he said, "And then the engine restarted, just caught and started producing power again, like the whole failure had never happened. And I don't know why it failed, and I don't know why it restarted, and I don't know what happened in between. And the maintenance team is going to tear it apart tomorrow, and they're going to find something mechanical that explains the failure, and maybe something that explains the restart. But they're not going to find anything that explains what you saw, because what you saw isn't in the aircraft. It's in whatever happened to the air or the physics or reality around the aircraft. And I don't think that's something mechanics can measure or fix." I asked him if he was scared, if what had happened had shaken his confidence in flying, and he looked at me finally and said, "I've been flying combat for 2 years. I've seen good pilots die from bad luck and bad pilots survive through dumb luck. I've seen aircraft stay in the air when they shouldn't and fall apart when they should have been fine. And what happened today was just the most extreme example of something I've always suspected, which is that we don't understand what we're doing up there as well as we think we do. We've just gotten good at pretending we're in control, when really we're all just guessing and hoping, and sometimes the guess is right and sometimes it's wrong, and today my guess was right, or maybe it wasn't even my guess. Maybe something else made the decision for me, and being scared of that seems pointless, because being scared won't change it. Lee. I didn't see much of Holloway after that conversation. We flew a few more missions together before Germany surrendered in May. And then the squadron was disbanded, and we all went home to try to become civilians again, to try to fit back into a world that had continued without us while we were learning to kill people from aircraft. I heard years later that Holloway had been killed in a test flight accident in 1952, heard that he'd been evaluating some new jet fighter and had experienced engine failure and had tried to restart and hadn't made it. And I wondered if that accident had involved another impossible moment, another suspension of physical laws that this time hadn't been enough to save him. But I had no way to know because test flight accidents were classified and the reports never mentioned anything unusual. Mitchell stayed in the Air Force after the war, made it his career, flew in Korea and Vietnam, and the last time I saw him was at a reunion in 1975, and he pulled me aside and asked if I still thought about that day over the Rhine, and I told him yes, told him I'd never stopped thinking about it, that it had become the lens through which I viewed everything else I'd experienced in the war, the moment that had shown me that reality was more fragile and more strange than I'd been taught to believe. He said he felt the same way, said he'd spent 30 years trying to find rational explanation for what we'd witnessed, and had concluded that either we'd seen something that science couldn't currently explain, or we'd both experienced identical hallucination brought on by combat stress and altitude and the particular chemistry of fear, and either possibility was disturbing enough that he'd stopped looking for answers and had learned to live with not knowing. I'm 81 years old now, living in Montana again where I started. And I'm telling this story because I've decided that carrying it in silence is worse than being thought crazy, that there's value in testimony even when testimony can't be verified, that somewhere in the archives or in other people's memories there might be other accounts of similar, impossible moments, other instances where pilots saw aircraft move in ways that shouldn't be possible and were told to forget what they'd seen or were labeled as unstable for reporting it. The dead-engine Mustang that climbed without thrust was real as the war and the men who died and the bases we flew from, and whatever force acted on it that day over the Rhine Valley, whether it was unknown aerodynamic phenomenon or mechanical anomaly or something else entirely that exists outside the categories I have language for, it saved Holloway's life and scattered 4 German fighters and demonstrated that the rules we thought governed flight were more flexible than training had taught us. Comment where you're watching from, and if this story meant something to you, subscribe to Aviator's Last Witness. The sky remembers what we saw even if we can't explain it, remembers every moment when physics paused and something else operated instead, and these memories deserve to outlive the men who carried them, deserve to be spoken aloud before we're all gone. And these testimonies are all that remain of the impossible things we witnessed above the clouds where no camera could capture them, and no instrument could measure them, and no report would ever dare to document them honestly. Because admitting that aircraft with dead engines can climb and accelerate would mean admitting that everything we thought we understood about flight was incomplete, was missing entire categories of possibility that only revealed themselves in moments of crisis when survival demanded that physics negotiate rather than dictate.